You're just getting passionate about fossil fuel subsidies.
I just can't believe we want to get rid of them. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Hail State Debate. You may have noticed we are in some new facilities here. This is our very impressive new studio that we're using with thanks to the Mississippi State University Digital Media Center. We really appreciate them having us. It is time for the November-December topic, and it's a policy-heavy one. It's kind of a straightforward policy one. Resolved, the United States ought to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels. On a scale of 1 to 10, just briefly, what do you give it?
I'd give this a 7. I think there's room on both sides and a lot of opportunities for plans or Ks or anything that you want to run on this.
As an LD topic, like a 5 or a 6. As a PF policy topic, yeah, 7 or 8. It's pretty good, just because there's, and we're going to talk about this, there's statistics on both sides about just about everything.
Yeah, I wasn't super crazy about it, but the more we've done research on it, I think there's a lot of interesting ground. Initially, I thought there wasn't a lot of philosophy. I thought it was going to be purely utilitarian, but I've kind of changed my mind on that. So I am more enthusiastic now than I was before. If you're new to the channel, most of you are coming back, but if you're new, we try to provide useful information on Lincoln Douglas and public forum debate to debaters around the country. We try to link it back to the real world. So we do talk about debate stuff, like Alicia mentioned, critiques and theory and things like that. But we also try to focus heavily on arguments that are used in the real world because we think that's the most effective and the most fun way to debate. So if it is useful to you, maybe give us a like, maybe subscribe. You can also follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate. We drop occasional articles about the topic, thoughts on new resolutions, just general stuff about debate. Maybe even the occasional reference to our own tournaments. We actually had a really good tournament this past weekend at Southern Miss. These guys, Josh and Alicia, competing as Joe-Licia. They made you name your team, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
we're
they-
Joe-Licia.
Me and Alicia are Joe-Licia, me and Parker are Joker.
Yeah. So they won the
great.
tournament. They did a really good job. We got some serious topics like the Paris Commune of 1871. But in the finals, we had a very, very serious, hardcore normative sort of debate about whether Subway was better than Jimmy John's. And I think it's fair to say we just kind of carpet bombed the other team with just masses of statistics.
And jokes. I think
yeah.
that's the funniest we've ever been in a debate round.
There were 5 different points in our constructive, and then the third point had 6 sub-points underneath it. It was incredible.
My voters were the chicken bacon ranch, the meatball marinara, and the steak and cheese. I think that really made a point.
Even at a serious debate tournament, there is a lot of evidence that Subway is better than Jimmy John's. It just is.
And there's a lot of evidence on this topic just as well.
That's true. There's linking back. So yes, bringing it back to this topic, there is a lot of evidence to get through. So we'll get right to that. So like I said, follow us on Twitter, like and subscribe. We are going to have all of our links, as always, down in the notes below, so you can follow along and find this stuff on your own. We are going to put the timestamps there as well, so hopefully that'll be useful to you. My general thoughts on it, I think it's a topic that requires some understanding of basic economics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think it's a topic where the AF probably has a little bit of an advantage going in, but I feel like that can be mitigated by a strategic neg, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And there are definitional fights to be had, absolutely. So there's all of that. Any starting thoughts you guys want to throw out at them?
This is going to be one where you're going to need to recognize which sources are valid. Basically, there's a lot of big international organizations that write reports on stuff like this, and there's also, very far left or far right-leaning sources that are going to tell you basically the same thing, but with a clear slant on it, and you're going to want to trust the ones that are big, international, well-established and respected organizations rather than ones with a clear bias on it.
Yeah, another thing to think about is this is going to be a complicated topic because fossil fuel subsidies aren't just lump sum payments that are given to ExxonMobil.
Right.
It's a lot more complicated than that, and if you didn't understand it coming in, I can guarantee your judge isn't going to understand it. So take a minute at the beginning of the case, especially if you're the affirmative, to really set the stage for what we're even talking about, and especially if you're going to run an idea of subsidies as including externalities like environmental pollution, deaths, and things of that nature.
Yeah, a lot to get to for us and for you. So we'll jump right into it. We're going to go first, definitions and framework as always, then we'll move on to talk a little bit about values and criteria, and then finally the AF and the negative. So we will come right back and get started with definitions in just a second. Okay, so getting started with definitions and framework, there's a lot to cover here, so we'll kind of try to go a little bit quickly, but still cover the subject. So let's just start at the beginning of the resolution with the United States. This is pretty straightforward. I think most people are going to interpret this as the United States federal government. There maybe is a little bit of room for playing there. For example, the United States being individual states. There are some states, like Texas, for example, that do provide some subsidies, like Texas provides $1.5 billion in tax relief. I think if you included that in an AF or something about it in an egg, I do think it's probably topical. I don't think this is something where you're going to have people running like 50 state counter plans. So I think that's pretty straightforward. Should include pretty much anything a U.S. government source does. You guys agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so on ought, also ought is pretty straightforward. We can sometimes have definitions about, debates about what the term ought means in some debates, like the idea of ought versus ought does not imply can or does imply can and things like that. I don't think it really matters here because what we have is we're just being asked to cut an existing policy of the government.
Right.
And we can clearly do that, right? This is not some like aspirational goal.
The thing is, though, you're going to see some dude who's going to give you like grief about the definition specifically, and what it's going to have to boil down to is just tell the judge, look, we know what we're talking about here. Don't let them get into semantics on this and try to confuse you.
Yeah. I mean, it's not something where we're debating about like an aspirational goal like ending hunger or something like that. This is something that clearly can be done. People do get a little cute with it. I wouldn't worry too much about it, but it is out there. So you guys are LD debaters. Like you know how it works, right? Eliminate. Okay, so eliminate from Webster is just put an end to or get rid of. So I don't, again, think there's a whole lot of room for manipulation here. Eliminate is a pretty absolute term. I mean, it means zero. It means none. I do think that the sort of generality and the absoluteness, I guess, of this term is an advantage for the negative. Kind of like on the Lincoln-Douglas topic the last 2 months, the idea of not considering standardized test scores, that's a pretty absolute demand, and I think it gave the negative a little bit more ground.
What do you think about eliminate in terms of time frame? Like, is this a thing that has to happen now, like today, or does both sides have ground to phase it out gradually?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything in the resolution that specifically says it can't be some kind of time frame. I think if you do a time frame, though, you start getting trade-offs on your impacts, right? The longer you wait to phase out these things or to eliminate them, the less of an impact, for example, you have on climate change, the longer you wait to get like additional revenues for things like that. So, I don't think I would fight a topic. I mean, some negative probably will, but I don't think I would fight a topicality battle because somebody says we phase them out over 10 years. I think that is a valid, a potential approach, right? But eliminate does, I think, give some room, for example, for counterplans, right? And we'll talk a lot about counterplans later, as a matter of fact. But I think the basic idea would be that, a negative could definitely find like 2 or 3 specific subsidies that we do and say, for example, this is a subsidy that deals with like carbon sequestration or something that's like maybe good for climate change, and latch onto that and say, we can get rid of some of them, but let's not get rid of all of them. Let's instead increase this one, right? Or something like that. So I think it gives you some flexibility when you're on the negative. But then we get to the really big one that's going to take up a few minutes of time to discuss, which is subsidies for fossil fuels, which I might call fossil fuel subsidies for short, but you get the idea. A lot of things to say about this. This is going to be an area where we fight on this resolution, and we need to spend a minute talking about it. So first of all, let's talk about the idea that this is a bare plural, right? Now, you've heard me talk about this before in other videos. The idea of a bare plural is a concept that like linguists and academics who study language talk about, and it's just this idea that when you have a term that is a noun and it's plural and you don't have some qualifier like some or most or all, the normal way that linguists in like linguistics literature interpret that is it refers to the category, right? So for example, if we say dogs are the best pets, we're not talking about like 2 or 3 or a handful of specific dogs. Like, what are you doing? We look so professional on this set, and like it gets out of this like jug of water. But like we're not talking about like a couple of dogs, like my dog Dozy and your dog Morty, right? Even though they are objectively the best pets, right? We're talking about dogs as a category, and here we have subsidies for fossil fuels, right? That's a bare plural. The argument from the definition that arguably the neg might make would be like, you can't come in and run a specific plan on this because of the bare plural. When it says subsidies for fossil fuels, that means you have to talk about the class of subsidies for fossil fuels. Now, this is a debatable point. This is something where you you can go back and forth and make arguments about it. There are theory arguments that you can run that we don't really have time to cover. But I think that one fair interpretation would be that no, you can't just sort of pick your favorite subsidy and try to sort of pull a fast one on the negative by just saying here's one very narrow like $5 million subsidy and we're going to get rid of that, right? Or just a couple of them. So anyway, that's one caveat. We know people will be running specific plans, but that would be a potential argument against it. We know some circuits are not crazy about plans. That's just something to be aware of if you want to go down the road of like picking out your favorite plan. But much more importantly, I think in terms of how we define subsidies is understanding all of the different types, and Alicia talked about this like in the intro, right? All of the different types of fossil fuel subsidies, because there are a lot of different layers. And like the way I like to think about it is it's sort of like if you've seen those pictures of like the Earth, right, from the core to like the mantle and then the crust, it's like a bunch of concentric circles. And at the middle, I would say you'd have things that are clearly fossil fuel subsidies, right?
I mean, like direct tax dollars going into, we want to prop up this specific industry or company.
Yeah, exactly. They are absolutely clearly subsidies, all the way out to some very sort of more extreme versions of like what a subsidy is. And so like if we start at the beginning, I think we start with direct subsidies. And there's actually a really good article on this that kind of classifies the different types, or at least many of the different types, from the Environmental and Energy Study Group in July 2019 that we will link to. But it starts out by listing the core stuff, like for example, the intangible drilling cost deduction. Now this is a tax deduction, right, that energy companies can make for basically drilling for oil. Now you might say, how is that a subsidy? You're not giving them any money. Well, the idea that you first of all, this goes only to fossil fuel companies. It's for people who are drilling for oil. And secondly, it is money that they would absolutely have had to pay to the government in terms of taxes. So rather than we take it from you and then we just give it back to you, which is inefficient, we just say you can deduct this from your taxes, right? And that's how it works. You can look at other things like percentage depletion, right? This is, again, another tax deduction for the depletion of your oil resources. Credit for clean coal investments, right? These are situations where you're giving out, for example, in 2005, Congress authorized $1.5 billion in tax credits for integrated gasification, which is basically a form of clean coal. And then, things like the non-conventional fuels tax credit, which has provided $12.2 billion to the coal industry from 2002 to 2010. These are all going to be things where we're talking specifically about the energy sector and specifically about like either money we're giving them or money that they would have had to directly pay. So these are clearly going to be topical, right?
But then there's other things that either play on the legal system and the way that corporations are set up and take advantage of the tax code in the United States to give them certain benefits. So stuff like master limited partnerships. Basically, the way that the tax credit is set up within the American economy is that if you combine different sorts of investments and the advantages that those investments can have, you can take away fewer income taxes on the production that you're having.
Right.
So basically, if this certain tax system lets you get more money net, that's counting as a subsidy, as an indirect subsidy, because it's money you wouldn't have to be paying otherwise.
What's really going on here is this is the sort of next level out in the concentric circles, right? These are things that do not apply specifically to the energy sector. So one definitional fight you're going to have to potentially have is if there is a legal vehicle that it's a matter of practice that it is used in the energy sector. So for example, Josh talked about like these master limited partnerships, which is a corporate structure. There's a thing called last in, first out accounting, which is very advantageous. It lets you basically lower your tax bill by using a creative accounting method. But these things are not specific to the energy sector. They're not specific to fossil fuels.
For like MLPs, only 3/4 of companies that are registered as MLPs are oil companies, but then again, 3/4 of these are in fact oil companies, so clearly they're the ones using it for the most benefit.
So the basic question, and again we'll link to this and I would urge you to look at it, is on these things that are not specific to the fossil fuel industry but they're heavily used by them, you're going to need to make a decision as the AF as are you going to try to bring those in as things that you would get rid of, and as the NEG you're going to have to ask, how am I going to fight against those? It's a real question as to whether these are topical, right? They are not specific to fossil fuels, but they are heavily used by companies that make fossil fuels. So there's a topicality question of are these fossil fuel subsidies, right? And I think that's the question you're going to have to answer. And the decision calculus on the AF is, on the one hand, if you try to include them, you're going to get a bigger dollar amount, right? You're going to get more money back for the government on your AF, right? You're going to arguably do more to slow down climate change, But at the same time, you're probably going to get a topicality fight from a good negative who's going to say some of what you're talking about is not fossil fuel subsidies. And these things have benefits in other areas, right? You're going to be taking away, if you get rid of, for example, last in, first out accounting, well, that might hit the fossil fuel industry, but there might be other industries that could be hurt by it too. So there's going to be kind of a decision calculus on how much stuff do you want to try to pack into this world of fossil fuel subsidies, right? And then the biggest, I think, area, and this is the one where the most debate will happen, and Alicia and I were talking about this like last weekend at the tournament, is this idea that a fossil fuel subsidy is literally any amount of money that, in terms of like societal damage or harm, that comes from fossil fuels that the government doesn't make them pay for. In other words, when a fossil fuel company produces fossil fuels and they get burned and they cause climate change and we put a dollar amount on whatever the damage of climate change is, if we're not making that company pay either through taxes or fines or something like the cost of that, then the argument that some folks make and some pretty non-trivial sources make is that entire amount of money is a subsidy. And it's a massive difference. Like when we talk about like direct subsidies, there's a Rolling Stone article that talks about how, we spend, I think, worldwide something like $400 billion, which worldwide, it sounds like a lot, but the truth is in the context of the global economy is not that much.
It's like maybe 1% of the total global GDP.
Right, so when you're talking about the actual amount of money we spend and either transfer or don't take directly from these fossil fuel companies, it's a fairly limited amount of money. But the IMF did a study this year in 2019 that talks about fossil fuel subsidies, right? And in that study, the way they define it is basically what we just said was what we call negative externalities. And in economics, a negative externality is just this idea that if a company produces something, a harm to society, and they don't have to pay for it, they're creating what's called an externality, right? So if a company dumps pollution in the river and it makes people sick and they don't have to pay for it, they have created an externality and they should have to pay for it. So according to the IMF, if we factor in, I don't remember the exact amount, but if we factor in all of the costs of climate change that we are not, as the government, making these companies pay for, what's the total is something like
$4.7 trillion that the IMF came to a total of.
Is that a year?
No, I think that was total within like the certain study that the IMF came off of.
But the IMF is basically saying that the total of the subsidy, in other words, our failure to make these companies pay the cost is a subsidy, and it amounts to $4.7 trillion a year.
So if I was feeling squirrely on the neg, like if the affirmative pulled out that argument, I would say, okay, basically for you to uphold the resolution, you have to completely mitigate all impacts of climate change. That is, we have to be, as a country, doing every single possible thing that we can do, from carbon taxes to subsidies for renewables to economic and environmental justice initiatives. So they really don't want to use that study against somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Right.
But what you can do is still break down what the IMF lists specifically.
Absolutely.
Because they do have an itemized list of where all these subsidies are coming in from. You can pick and choose and be like, oh, here are the huge things. This is clearly a problem. We need to address this specifically.
Yeah, we're certainly going to link to the IMF study. And if you don't read that, then you're probably just not doing what you need to do to debate this topic.
Right.
It's going to come up in every single round you go into.
And if you
the
want
number
a
of 4.7 trillion or 5.2 trillion is going to come up in every single round.
Right, and if you want a really good card against it, The Atlantic has an article that's entitled "The Hidden Subsidy of Fossil Fuels" that has a really good analysis of why you shouldn't necessarily calculate the externalities in considering to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies or not. And the reason is if you take away the actual direct fossil fuel subsidies, you're not necessarily going to improve anything in terms of those indirect subsidies. And we have actual further evidence basically talking about how carbon emissions won't go down appreciably if we got rid of all direct subsidies. And part of that's because most of those are geared towards consumption and helping people purchase things like heating oil for their homes in the winter rather than like production-based subsidies.
The basic idea, though, is there's going to probably in many rounds be a fight between the affirmative that very well may try to say, here's this massive $1 trillion cost. Like I'm looking at the data, I think one article says that if you use the IMF numbers, the United States subsidies every year for fossil fuels are $649 billion, which is bigger than our military budget. So that's why the app is going to bring that in. They're going to want to say, you cut that much, that's good. I think the real issue, right, is that you're going to have a linguistic debate about like what the word subsidy means, right? If you're on the neg and you want to keep them from using that, yes, you have turns like you can use that Alicia talks about, this is just too much and that sort of stuff. But you also have an argument that says, look, when we just don't tax somebody to make up, that's not a subsidy. Like just declining to tax somebody is not the same thing as a subsidy in common language, right? When we, for example, say, it sort of assumes that the government owns everything. And if the government doesn't tax you for something you've done, they're
just being nice and giving you that.
They're like giving you a gift by the very fact that they didn't punish you or tax you. And while it is true that some economists do say that the failure to tax a pollution or something like that is the equivalent of a subsidy, there's a big difference between saying something is the equivalent of something and that it is something. Like in a district that's heavily Democratic, we could say that the primary election is the equivalent of the general election, but that doesn't mean it is the general election. Look, there's a word for what they're describing when they say get rid of all this stuff. It's called a carbon tax or cap and trade. There are very simple words for we make people pay the full cost of social externalities. They exist in the literature. They're very common. Carbon tax, cap and trade. If the NSDA had wanted us to have a debate about a carbon tax or cap and trade, then they would have written a resolution about that. But what you're having to do to accept that definition of subsidy is to say that what they meant to say was we are going to eliminate the absence of effective taxation on all forms of carbon, but what they said was eliminate subsidies. And that just seems to be like an implausible stretch, but regardless. Now, on the other side, to be fair, there is another argument which says that, look, when we let these companies pollute and we don't make them pay for it, the government actually does end up paying for it. They pay for it through having to build seawalls to stop sea levels rising and to go out and address health problems, people having heat strokes and things like that, and they really are kind of subsidizing it. But anyway, just be aware that that is a sort of deep debate that we're going to have about what exactly is a subsidy. Are we talking $400 billion on one hand that's the actual money we sort of pay out or don't take in directly, or are we talking about this massively larger number, and you need to be ready to fight on that. So I guess the next thing we can talk about a little bit is values and criteria. So looking at values and criteria, for me, it's fairly straightforward, but I do think, Alicia probably has some good alternatives maybe for the con. For me, I think this is very much a utilitarian type of resolution. Utilitarianism, being just greatest good for the greatest number. And the idea is, there are certain topics where we're going to have a fundamental disagreement about what is good and what is bad. Things where we're talking about basic rights versus security and things like that. But in this case, I don't really feel like there's a lot of disagreement that most debaters are going to have about what's good. The question is really just how we balance it, right? Most people are going to agree, most judges are going to agree, most debaters are going to agree that we do need to have energy to warm people's homes, get them to work, run their TVs, things like that. And most people are going to agree that climate change and pollution are bad, right? And that we want to mitigate them, that they have economic costs. So there's no trying to have different visions of what rights are or what morality is. We need energy, we need it to be affordable, we need to address climate change, we need government revenue. The question is, how do we best balance all of those things, right? And to be fair, there are different ways that you can come at utilitarianism. Like Rawls was a utilitarian. He just thought that the best way to measure utility was, to look at the least advantage first, right? We need to look at the benefits to those who are in the worst position is the right way to calculate how you do utility. There's also, for example, Karl Popper, right? Karl Popper does utilitarianism, who talks about just avoiding suffering. He doesn't get into maximizing pleasure or enjoyment. He just talks about avoiding suffering. And you might talk about, for example, how we need to focus on avoiding suffering for people who are the least advantaged in the economy. But again, I feel like utilitarianism, it's not the only option by any means, but I think it's going to be what you see in at least half of all your rounds. So.
Right, so what I would do is I'd definitely go with utilitarianism on the affirmative side, but if I were running a negative case, I would go more in the direction of, like Brett said, Rawls and his principles of justice. Very simply, Rawls has two principles of justice. The first is the principle of equal liberty, which is this idea that each person has an equal right to the most extensive liberties, compatible with similar liberties for all. That gets really tongue-tied, but basically everyone should have equal liberty. The second is the difference principle, which basically says any inequality in society should be tilted to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged people.
Right, and that kind of just goes back to utilitarianism, the most amount of good for people who need it the most.
But it's
right.
more
it's
than
more
that.
specific
right.
than that.
How do you look at that, right?
Right, so basically what we can see with this is that subsidies in the context of fossil fuels lead to overproduction. And when we have too much supply of something, that drives prices down. So what you could argue, and what I would argue on the negative, is this idea that low fossil fuel prices globally are really good for emerging economies because it allows them to develop like the countries that are now developed were able to. So I have a study that I'll drop in the links for you that basically talks about how when we have low oil prices, the disproportionate benefit goes to emerging economies who stand to benefit from higher household income, lower input costs, which just means they can make things more cheaply for export or for their own consumption, and improved external positions, which is like an idea of competitive advantage.
Yeah, and so this is, I think that's actually a great approach for the negative, which is to say, look, in the United States, we may take for granted that we can address climate change cheaply and maintain our standard of living. But in this particular area, if we choose this particular approach, then we're going to be removing lower cost oil for far less advantaged countries, and that we should put their welfare ahead of our own in this particular instance. It's not a bad approach.
Well,
Basically because we can afford to and they can't.
Yeah, and the other point on that is Brett talked about keeping certain subsidies and not others, and he specifically mentioned like carbon capture and sequestration and things like that. And what I'd argue there is even if we no longer need carbon capture in the US because we can just switch to renewables, we have countries that have just recently developed and built coal plants and natural gas plants in the past 10 years or so. And it's unethical for us to say, hey, you have to shut that down.
Yeah.
Instead, we should develop that technology and transfer it to them so they can continue to develop and benefit without harming global economy.
So actually, this kind of goes to the fact that there are a lot of good negative arguments out there that I didn't really anticipate at least when I personally got started. So we will definitely get to those. Don't want to spoil them right now. But so that's basically all we've got on definitions, framework, values, and criteria. And so now we will jump to the part you've all been waiting for, the actual arguments on the affirmative. Okay, so getting started on the affirmative, I think that there are a lot more angles than I initially believed there would be, but the big one, and the one we've all got to wrestle with, obviously, is going to be climate change and just the environment in general, right? These are going to be the main reasons why you'd want to do away with fossil fuel subsidies, and the major impacts for the affirmative, and maybe potentially some impacts for the negative. So before we get to that, I will say I think that the affirmative needs to, because this topic can be so complicated, tell a very simple and coherent story. And this is what I was kind of talking about earlier, which is explaining that fossil fuels create what are called major economic externalities. And you need to know what that term means, and you need to be able to explain it and say an externality is just a situation where a company creates a cost for society and we don't make them pay for it. And instead, either the government has to pay for it, like with climate change, we have to pay for, like we said, seawalls and health issues and food security and things like that, or people just have to suffer through it, like it gets hotter and people just don't enjoy their lives as much, right? Economic development goes down because of climate change, right? And so the idea is very simple here. As the affirmative, what you're saying is, look, when a company creates an externality, like when they dump pollution in the river, we should make them pay for it, right? We make them pay for it through taxes or fines or lawsuits or whatever. And amazingly, somehow here, we're not only not making them pay for it, we're doing the opposite, right? We're paying them to do it, right? And the basic idea on the affirmative is very simple. Like if somebody is dumping toxic waste, in your backyard, well, you need to make them pay for it. But the first thing you need to do is stop paying them to do it, right? And the basic narrative that the affirmative says is we just want to make these companies exist on an even playing field. Let's stop picking favorites. Let's stop choosing the winners in the economy, and let's stop giving money to the people that are causing climate change. And then maybe from there, we can move on and start talking about taxing them. Or maybe if you want to be more aggressive and you want to use that $4.7 billion figure with the IMF, maybe then, maybe you say we go ahead and tax them now. That's debatable. But the first thing you do when you're in a hole is you stop digging the hole, right? And that's the basic affirmative strategy, I think, here. So in terms of substantive arguments, again, as I say, I think you start with climate change. And there's a reason why climate change is used as the impact in debates on even things that have absolutely nothing to do with the climate, right? It's
because there's a giant impact.
It's just a huge impact. It's like, it's the only rival to sort of like nuclear war in policy debate for what your impacts are. And this is going to be a debate where you actually plausibly, feasibly get to it without having to do too much of a stretch. And so, we're not going to spend all day sitting here just telling you, like, we could read you huge impacts from climate change all day, but you can go out and find those. You don't need us. It's just a couple, if you just want to get a flavor for what we're talking about here, if you're kind of new to this massive impact style of debating.
A little taste of how many millions of people will die because of climate
just
change.
a little flavor of how many deaths we're going to see, right? But so on deaths, there's this research group called Impact Lab. Well, that's a great name. It estimates that you'll have 1.5 million additional deaths per year due to climate change, even if we implement mitigation strategies by the year 2100. I mean, it's hard to outweigh that without like a world war or something.
And what's important is they're directly linking this to climate change as well. So you don't even have to worry about inherency or like how exactly this follows with the resolution. They're saying because of climate change, 1.5 million deaths.
And then, for example, economic impact, you've got Columbia's Earth Institute estimates that the U.S. alone will lose up to $520 billion in GDP due to climate change eventually. So, and again, you can find your own statistics. If you're at a program that has a big set of files, you may have a stack of cards about this, but it's not hard to find like massive impacts that we absolutely have to avoid.
Well, and you can carry those as far as you want to, because there's a lot of compelling evidence that actually climate change leads to war and instability and migration and just pretty much anything bad in the world. Climate change is responsible.
You can absolutely link climate change to resource wars to nuclear wars. I mean, whatever you want to do. And the thing is, on a resolution like this, it's not completely implausible if you make the link between the resolution and climate change. And that's not as easy as some people might think. I think the key thing for the affirmative in getting impacts in this debate is going to be making the link between removing fossil fuel subsidies and meaningfully addressing climate change.
And actually, I have a really good source on that. This comes from the Stockholm Environment Institute. What they found is that fossil fuel subsidies just in the United States have taken 20 billion barrels worth of oil from unprofitable to profitable. Basically, we have reserves that we know are there, but it doesn't make sense economically to do all the work to retrieve that oil.
Right.
But when you have the subsidy, that calculus changes, and that is directly responsible for, I believe it says 6 billion tons of CO2 emissions.
I mean, it makes sense that it becomes profitable whenever you just don't have to pay to do all the costs of extracting it. It's as simple as that.
So that's important. You need to be able to make the argument, obviously, that when you want, and this is another basic economic concept, the way subsidies work is what a subsidy is the government or whoever looks at something and says, the market is not producing as much of this as I want. I'm going to inject money into the process to lower the cost to the producer, right? So I get more of it. Subsidies make you get more of something, right? That's how it works.
Right, and the other thing that this article points out is that it's a self-sustaining process. Like the idea that when you have subsidies that drive down the price of oil, the power of the subsidy is even more beneficial.
So, and so on this, I think it's very important to have a piece of evidence, a link in there, like Alicia's pointing to, that says subsidies are going to give us more. They're going to give us more fossil fuels, but they're also going to give us then necessarily more carbon emissions, right? But then, to be fair, though, I think the affirmative needs to be aware there's going to be pushback on this issue. So, for example, Robinson Meyer in February 2018 in The Atlantic wrote this article about how basically, the idea is that the amount we actually spend in subsidies, and he has it pegged at this $400 billion number, which is the relatively low end, doesn't really do that much in terms of carbon emissions. He argues at some point in the piece that it only would result, getting rid of it entirely would only result in about a 1 to 5% reduction in carbon emissions.
Right, and that's coming from Science Daily. This was published in Nature. It's looking at worldwide fossil fuel subsidies, though, and not just the United States.
Right.
So I'd argue that the evidence that I just provided you would trump in that case.
Well, there's no question. And so this basically gets to a core point that I think that the affirmative is going to have to be wrestling with when it comes to linking to the impacts of climate change, which is how much can we as the United States really do? Right? How much can this particular policy within the United States do? And I think you need to have a clear story and a clear narrative for why your approach is best. And I think there's several options, right? The first option is you can try to win the argument that and this is not perfect, but you can try to win the argument that fossil fuel subsidies are this thing that the IMF says they are, which is anything we don't tax, right? Any carbon we don't tax is a subsidy, and therefore we're talking about $4.7 trillion. And if that's the case, then you're going to get a lot of traction, I think, in terms of if we stop doing that. In other words, if we stop doing this subsidy and basically tax all carbon emissions effectively, then yes, we're going to see some significant reduction of climate change.
But if it's only 400 billion and that's going to effectively cripple a large industry in the United States, is that really worth it? That's the counterbalance.
Right, and that's the argument. If you don't go big and you don't try to say that the subsidies are all untaxed carbon and you don't win that, then you're going to have a much smaller amount and you're going to be looking at these 1 to 5% reductions. As Alicia points out, that is globally. But at that point, you have some other options. The second option you can have is to sort of run a why not kind of case. In other words, a don't make the perfect the enemy of the good kind of case and say, look, here's the thing. Of course, this is not going to get rid of all of climate change, but we need to begin the process of doing 100 little things as a global community to address this. If we basically say that one step is never going to be long enough to get us from here to the end of the race, then we'll never start taking steps, right?
Well, and something you could argue on that is this idea of like cars, for instance. When gas prices are high because we don't have as much supply or any other factor, people are more likely to buy electric vehicles. Like we're in the United States where people could do that whether gas prices are low or not. But the impetus for them buying a new car is those high prices. So even if we're just trying to change behavior in the United States, that would be an argument that you could run, that we're focusing on how to make the United States do what is best for global climate action.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that the basic idea is, look, I think that AF needs to acknowledge, of course, this isn't a magic silver bullet that's going to solve all climate change. We're showing you some impacts on climate change. We're not saying that this is going to get rid of every one of them. What we are saying is that, first of all, this does something, right? This begins the process of contributing. This doesn't say, well, if we can't fix it, we shouldn't do anything. The second thing is, though, it's going to save us money, right? We're going to get more revenue for the government, to do other things that are better. And we'll talk about that later on in the AF section. But the basic idea would be like, why not? Like if, for example, you could eat more healthily and save a little bit of money and lose a little bit of weight, why wouldn't, and you wanted to lose weight, like that was your goal, like why wouldn't you do that? You could say, well, it's not going to
because I'm not going to be Mr. Universe.
Yeah, I'm not going to be Mr. Universe, or I'm not going to be able to run a marathon. Well, so what? You saved some money, right? You've lost a little weight. You're better off on both fronts. Why would you not do that, right? And that would, in the argument, that would be kind of the argument. The other thing I will say is there are some kind of good critical arguments out there, and I haven't read the sources on these. I'll try to find them. I know I've seen them in the past. For the idea, and you could just make this as a critical argument, that this whole idea that you can't fix the whole problem is the problem, right? That's the thing that is paralyzing the discourse on climate change, and it's keeping us from making progress. You could actually, if your neg says, well, you can't fix the whole problem, the AF could actually run a pretty strong critique saying that is exactly what's wrong with the climate debate today. It's people who say we can't fix it all in one step, and that's why we never do anything. You should vote against that just because it's bad, right? So. Anyway, I think that we could spend all day talking about just the pure impact of climate change, but I think you need to be ready as the AF to have your narrative about why we can't fix it all, but why doing something is better than nothing.
Well, I think something else we need to talk about is the idea of the economic side.
Yeah.
You're talking about saving a little money and using it elsewhere, but it might be more important to look first at where the money for the subsidy is actually going.
Okay.
And returning to that Stockholm environment source, what they found is that at $50 per barrel, more than half of the subsidy goes directly to oil company profits. And when that price goes up at $100 per barrel, 98% of the subsidy is pure profit for ExxonMobil.
Right, and you need to be, and this is good stuff because it cuts through a lot of sort of the higher level, discussion about causation and discussion about balancing interest, and it just says, look, even if in a hypothetical, theoretical world, there could be good subsidies.
98% of it is not good.
Right. Even in a hypothetical world where these things could be necessary to lower the cost to poor consumers or to just make it so that it's viable to get the oil out of the ground, in the real world Judge, we need to be debating about the real subsidies that actually exist. And in the real world that actually exists, the overwhelming majority of this money is just going to make the shareholders of these companies richer. And that's not a valid reason to subsidize climate change. And I think having statistics like that cut the Gordian knot, so to speak, right, is very, very important on this topic. I do think, though, that we do need to kind of shift gears a little and talk about the philosophical and moral angles on this topic, kind of the justice-based arguments. And I know we have several. I'll start with mine, and then you guys can jump in with yours. The one I want to look at is intergenerational justice. I think this is a strong argument for the app. Intergenerational justice is the idea, and it's not unique to climate change. It happens on things like the national debt and stuff. But like when we incur costs that are going to be paid by future generations, right? The idea is we're sort of stealing from them, right? When we do things now that are going to hurt people, our descendants, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and they're not here to have a vote on it, we are effectively denying them justice by sort of stealing from them. And there's just a ton of literature on this idea out there. We'll link to a very lay-friendly article from UNICEF that explains it in sort of judge-friendly terms. There's also an article by Edith Brown Weiss of Georgetown in 2008 that's a little bit more of a scholarly overview, but you can find tons and tons of stuff. But the basic argument runs like this. When we subsidize fossil fuels and we make them cheaper and we can buy gas cheaper and heating oil cheaper and all this stuff, and we burn them and we create carbon emissions and climate change, yet our lives are more comfortable. Like we're not going to directly experience the worst ravages of climate change. You guys might a little bit. I'll probably
Thanks, Brett.
I'll probably be dead by then, right? But I'm not going to experience them. But my life is certainly more comfortable. The gas that I buy in my car is cheaper. My heating, for my home is cheaper. And basically what I'm doing is I'm enjoying a better life, and you guys and your great-grandchildren are going to have to pay the cost. You're going to have, like we said earlier, lower economic growth, more deaths, more government funding of things like mitigation projects, and having to pay to address health and sea level rising and things like that. So what this does, I think, is it creates it is kind of utilitarian, but it's a little bit more justice based, right? Instead of just sort of saying, let's figure out what the best outcome is right now, it says, look, these people that don't exist yet, they have interests too, and we're stealing from them. And it almost lets you run kind of a categorical imperative type argument, of like a deontological argument, or like don't steal, right? Like stealing is bad. And by by subsidizing this stuff and making it cheaper for us now, we're stealing literal money and lives and welfare from future generations, and that's bad. And I think that this is a really good angle to take if you want a sort of more moralistic, less statistics-driven case, right? I think the last big thing that I have on the affirmative, and I don't really have a ton in the way of evidence, I think it's pretty obvious, and I'm just going to throw it out, is the idea that this money could be better spent, right? And I think the sort of two basic prongs of every app are going to be, number one is going to be climate change and pollution, but the other is going to be whatever amount you basically say we're giving away in subsidies, the argument will be it could be better spent, right? And on this, we don't really have to tell you how to do it. You can go out and just pick your favorite thing. As a matter of fact, just a minute ago, we were looking at one of these websites dealing with climate change. What did it said something like, would you rather
cut $2.6 billion in education for this girl like writing with a pencil?
Yeah.
Or would you rather provide $8 billion for oil subsidies? And it's like, well, it's not exactly what we're doing, but that's the general idea.
But the basic idea is in the magical world of debate where we can do anything, right? I mean, I don't think you can tell them you're going to fiat. I mean, I don't think you have power as the judge to like fiat that this will happen. But you can basically like list a million things that we're underfunding: infrastructure, education, teacher pay. You're debating debating for the teachers, whatever you want, right? And you can say there are a million things that this could be better spent on, right? And we should prioritize those things over
shareholder profits.
Over shareholder, yeah. Like no matter what, and your opponent might say, well, you don't get to pick what we spend it on. That's true. Like you don't get to pick what we spend it on. But literally anything is better than just propping up shareholder profits, right? If it's education, if it's infrastructure, if it's honestly just giving it back as a tax break to everybody as opposed to just Exxon shareholders, right? I mean, anything would be better than that. And so I think you have something in there that talks about the revenue angle. We're giving away $8 billion for this subsidy, $1.2 billion for that subsidy. We're woefully underfunded here. I think that's important.
And I think that's one of the good ways, talking about what that money is not going to, is a good way to include those negative externalities into the definition of what a subsidy is. It's like, look, if we're not collecting revenues on these things, that's revenues that we're not being able to put into things like education or transportation, infrastructure, stuff like that. You
could absolutely link to a national debt issue. If you look back to our PF thing on the national debt from last semester of last year, we could talk about how it could just be used for debt reduction. I mean, we can't say what it will be spent for, even if we just brought it into the government in general.
I mean, that's $600 billion that we didn't otherwise have.
Yeah, if you buy right. If you buy if you buy the IMF number, and that what we're talking about in the United States is $649 billion, you'd be 64% of the way to wiping out our entire deficit. Our deficit is $1 trillion a year. We're adding it every year. This is another intergenerational problem. We're stacking up debt for you and your generation. if you win that the amount is that, $649 billion, kind of a hard sell. But if you could win that,
you've instantly cut that in half.
You've more than cut that in half. But even if you don't, even if you're talking about a few billion here, a few billion there, reducing the debt, is a decent argument. On all of the things we talk about, there's going to be a certain, we can't fix the whole thing kind of problem to it, but doing something better than nothing is going to be a common refrain, right?
Right. So another thing that shows that reducing fossil fuel subsidies will actually have a meaningful impact on climate. An independent research group found that if the United States used its soft power for reducing fossil fuel subsidies in other countries, by taking the lead and reducing them or eliminating them in their own country, we could reduce a quarter of the carbon emissions that we need to reduce to meet our Paris Climate Agreement pledges.
Okay, well there you go. I mean, again, it's something better than nothing, showing people that we are making progress, reducing a sort of sense of hopelessness. I think that's good.
Well,
that's an
actually,
angle.
that goes into one of the values that I wanted to talk about was the benefit to democracy, or like the legitimacy of government promises. Because especially with Trump in office right now and the effects that he's had on the Paris Climate Accord, the fact that we didn't actually ratify it, we're not a part of it in the first place. There's a good article by the Natural Resources Defense Council talking about, look, if a lot of these big G7 countries have pledged and say that they want to do it, but they still contribute, $100 billion a year towards the production of and consumption of oil, gas, all these other things, if we can't even uphold these promises, what reason do the citizens have to believe that we could uphold anything else, or that we're actually working towards their benefit, right? Basically, it relies on a couple of assumptions. First of all, it inherently relies on the fact that climate change is something that only governments can fix, right? Because it's such a large-scale issue that you need government intervention to do something about it. Second, if these benefits of fixing climate change extend to all of humanity, then three, naturally government should want to fix climate change, but we're not doing that. Why is it? Well, it's to line the pockets of like corporate shareholders or CEOs of Exxon.
Well, see, now that you talk about that, I got to come back to another thing, which is relevant to intergenerational justice,
Right.
is international justice. And the idea is that, and Alicia's evidence does talk a little bit about, like, if you use Alicia's evidence about how our subsidies reduce costs for other countries, that would kind of answer this. But if your opponent doesn't know that, right, if they don't know that we're effectively helping other countries through these subsidies, right, a sort of generic argument would be something along the lines of, by subsidizing these companies, we're lowering costs for U.S. consumers, right? We're improving profits for U.S. corporations. So the benefits all flow directly to the United States, which I know there's mitigating arguments on that, but that would be the argument, right? Whereas the costs are spread across the entire world, right? The cost of climate change flow to, all over the world. And there's a lot of evidence out there about how the people who will be hit worst by climate change are those who are least economically able to mitigate it. It'll be people in the developing world, poorer countries. So again, the sort of distributive justice idea that comes from Rawls will be that, like, even if it were like a perfect balance, right? Even if we got exactly as much benefit as we do cost, like even if it was just as good as climate change is bad, right? The argument would be that the good is flowing to people who
don't need it, really.
Don't need it, and the bad is flowing to people in the developing world who are going to be hurt really bad by it. And I'm sure there's sources out there that say that.
Right, or if...
Well, the idea is the harms in the United States could be like you pay more, but the harms in these countries are people die. And it's as simple as that.
Right.
Well, I think another thing to talk about is even if you scope it entirely to the United States, there's still a disparate impact between rich and poor people and white people and people of color in terms of pollution. This just comes from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they found that Black and Hispanic Americans experience 55% more air pollution than they cause, while white Americans suffer 17% less than they cause. So like that disparate impact is very important because your local coal plant isn't in the really nice white neighborhood. Like you know where it gets put.
There's a critical race angle here if you want to use it because, I mean, let's just be blunt. I mean, it's not uniform, it's not universal, but if we're talking about adding profits to ExxonMobil, we're talking about mainly benefiting the pocketbooks of wealthier white people. And when we're talking about pollution, we're talking about mainly, there's a lot of evidence on this in lower income areas. So if you wanted to run with that, it is viable. I don't think that we necessarily have time to go into the details of it, but you can find evidence on that. So a lot of great options on the affirmative.
Right, and actually, if you want like one more like really like slam dunk kind of argument on this, like just if you want to use like racism or something like that as an impact. When fossil fuel subsidies are used to support infrastructure like pipelines, this actually comes from the example of the Keystone Pipeline.
Right.
What they found is that the impact of that pipeline was that indigenous women and girls were subject to more rape, murder, kidnapping, and crimes of that nature. And the reason for this is that basically man camps sprout up in the area like for those projects, and the net result is that women are raped and murdered and missing and all of these different horrible things. So that would be a great argument to run.
And again, just to remind your judge, this is happening so that you
Right
can
now.
line the pockets of Exxon CEO.
Running a case that's basically like these companies are bad, it's not crazy, right? I mean, it's really not. It's like sort of like if you want to say like we're subsidizing the equivalent of like what's an evil fictional corporation?
Monsanto. Let's
No,
just
no,
make
no,
up
no,
a
no,
company
no,
like
Monsanto is
Monsanto.
a real corporation. I meant like Wayland Yutani and like the Alien universe. You're subsidizing bad people, right? I mean, now I'm not crazy. I know people who work in the oil and gas sector, and they're certainly not all.
I mean,
bad
we're
people.
both chemical engineers.
Right,
We
they're-
want
Right,
those
we
industries.
do this for a living.
There are
but-
good folks out there working in oil fields just trying to make a living, but and for purposes, I want to be clear about that, but for purposes of an LD case in a 35-minute round, right, can you make a case that we're subsidizing bad people who do bad things? Yes, you can, right?
Yeah, and just like you don't have to look hard to find impacts to indigenous peoples when it comes to resources. We have absolutely moved people in our history as a country just to exploit the resources in an area. So that's not a stretch at all.
So anyway, like I say, a lot of good options on the affirmative, almost too many to cover, but we've got to move on because we got a time limit, and so we will come back in just a second and talk a little bit about the strongest arguments on the negative side of the resolution.
All right, so now we're going to jump into the negative, which is the side I was kind of attracted to because at first glance it looks more difficult.
That's the chemical engineering major.
But I would actually argue that there's more room on the negative just because you have a tremendous amount of latitude. Like if you're the affirmative, you run climate change is bad.
Right.
It's hard to be too squirrely with that. But with the neg, you really have three options of chases that you can run. A, you can say that fossil fuel subsidies are good. B, you can say that fossil fuel subsidies are bad, but the alternatives are worse. Or three, you can say that fossil fuel subsidies will use up the political capital that would be necessary to have a better alternative, such as a carbon tax or increasing and making permanent renewable energy subsidies. So I'm going to start with the idea that fossil fuel subsidies actually aren't that bad. And what we see, I'm focused on natural gas because that's really where most of our production is coming from. That's what we're burning most frequently. So the idea here, my contention title would be U.S. natural gas exports are a net benefit for global emissions. What we see is if you look at global emissions reductions, more global emission reductions have come from coal to natural gas or diesel to natural gas fuel switching than have come from building renewables. And that kind of gets down into the variability of renewables and their size being smaller than centralized power plants. But what the bottom line here is, there are a lot of countries in the world that still burn oil, like Saudi Arabia, or still burn diesel, like countries in the Caribbean, and still burn coal, like in Asia.
Or even more basically than that, people who
Wood.
burn wood, like in
Wood,
India.
trash,
Right.
anything you can think of, and all of those are more carbon intensive
Right.
than natural gas. And if you really want to get into the chemistry of that, we could do that. But basically, natural gas is less emissions intensive. So the bottom line of this argument is that natural gas is less emissions intensive than the alternatives being like oil, diesel, wood, trash.
Yep.
So when the United States and other developed nations overproduce natural gas, it's really cheap for export, and these countries are taking advantage of natural gas being cheap and readily available. And what this is actually translated to is emissions reductions in the Caribbean, Europe, and Asia. And Asia being particularly important because this is directly translated to better air quality in Beijing. I got a source from the Hill that says the air quality in terms of NOx, SOx, particulate matter, carbon dioxide has decreased.
Come in with the jargon, the NOx and the SOx.
Yeah.
it'll knock your socks off, right?
Yeah, NOx and SOx being nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides, which are bad for things like acid
They're
rain.
both chemical
and-
engineering majors, if we haven't mentioned that several times.
Yeah, but it's directly translated to better air quality in Beijing, and we all know how bad air quality in China was supposed to be.
Right.
And the Department of Energy has done a life cycle analysis on this, so there's direct evidence to this effect.
So, I mean, I think the basic idea is, look, we are lowering the cost of cleaner, less bad fossil fuels, right? We're not going to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And it's not just benefiting, a slightly cleaner here in the United States where we might not burn wood, right? We might burn something relatively clean. It's being exported overseas. The United States has become one of the world's major exporters, thanks to fracking and things like that over the last couple of decades of fossil fuels, of gas and things along those lines. And we have to basically, live in the world that actually exists, right? And this actually comes to, I'm going to tie this in because this ties in really well with the point I was about to make, which was that I think counterplans on this are valid. Right now, Alicia's pointing out how you don't even really need a counterplan. You can just basically say the idea is we are going to lower the price of this stuff. It's going to go out into the world to places where we would be burning even worse types of fossil fuels. It's going to substitute for them, and it's going to reduce these emissions. We as the United States don't have the ability to control what these other countries burn. The only way we can make it cleaner in India or in any of these other countries, the only way we can make them burn cleaner things is to give them cheaper fuels that are cleaner. That's the only way we do it, and the only way to do that is through subsidizing them, right? That's the basic argument. And you can do that with, and by the way, also I'll note there's some evidence out there, if you want to talk about like why this is going to have to happen for a while going forward, there's plenty of evidence out there about how there's no feasible way for the world to wean itself off of fossil fuels entirely for a long time, right? There's an article like here in the conversation, this is an article I was looking at, that there's no plausible way to get off fossil fuels entirely even by the year 2100. So the argument is, for the time being, while there are going to be fossil fuels, we need to be exporting the least bad ones we can at the lowest price we can, and we do that through subsidies. But I would go even farther and say, if that's not enough for you, you could potentially run a counterplan and say, look, we are totally fine with you getting rid of maybe some of these subsidies if you wanted to. Like some of it, this is different. This would say, like, we're fine with you sort of getting rid of some, if you don't want to go for the international angle, we're okay with getting rid of some general subsidies, like maybe subsidizing, the entirety of the field. But there are other subsidies that focus on cleaner energy that we need to keep. So for example, like we talked about in the first section, the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, or DOE-LPO, creates loans and other forms of incentives and grants and things like that of up to $8 billion in these low interest loans, right, that advance, for example, cleaner fossil fuel programs. There's subsidies that we do, for example, according to Yale Environment 360, there are tax credits that we do for carbon capture, and we give these to fossil fuel energy companies. And the basic idea would be like, what you have to do in this debate app is you have to get rid of all fossil fuel subsidies. And what we as the negative advocate for is, fine, get rid of the worst ones, get rid of the ones that are not targeted, but we ought to refocus, right? We ought to pick a few of these things like carbon capture subsidies, like loans for cleaner energy, and we ought to continue those subsidies. In other words, fossil fuel subsidies that focus fossil fuel companies on making cleaner energy, that incentivize them to have cleaner energy. And so what you have to do, is you have to eliminate it entirely. We're saying you can get rid of some of it, but keep the ones that are focused on cleaner energy. That's a counterplan I think is potentially viable.
And there is evidence for that. For instance, the Houston Chronicle and the Wall Street Journal mentioned the fact that Exxon, currently they're looking towards a revenue neutral carbon tax. And basically what this does is say, Exxon saying, look, okay, if you lower our tax liabilities in other directions, we'll pay to help reduce the amount of CO2 that we're emitting into the atmosphere. So we get a little bit of the best of both worlds. They're still allowed to produce really cheap oil, but they're mitigating some of the environmental impacts they're having. But either way, they're still profiting. They're still profiting.
And the basic idea in either scenario, whether it's Alicia's like this is just good in the world that exists, or a counterplan where we say, fine, get rid of some of them, but keep others that are keep these other subsidies that are focused on clean energy. Either way, the basic message that the negative is going to be offering here is we have to live in the real world that actually exists. We can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. We can go out on this sort of quest to get rid of all of these subsidies that's going to maybe reduce emissions by like 1% in the world, or what we can do is use the leverage of these subsidies to gradually drag these fossil fuels companies kicking and screaming into a world where they're somewhat cleaner, right? They're somewhat less bad, because we know we're going to have to live for probably a century, right, as a species before we're completely done with these fossil fuels. And so just taking our hands off completely is a bad idea, right?
Alicia, have you seen the evidence regarding the idea that more renewable energy sources actually require much higher government subsidies to stay profitable? So if you're looking towards going towards cleaner energy, you're actually going to need more government subsidies just because they're not quite as profitable as oil and gas. So if the idea is reduce government spending for cleaner energy, well, that's not going to happen if you get rid of oil subsidies, because you have to subsidize way more to get the same amount of energy production out of things like wind or solar.
Right, yeah, just because of that capacity factor, which just means how often in a year is that resource producing. With coal, it's something like 60%, and same with natural gas. Nuclear, it's like 95%. But wind and solar, you're lucky 15, if you're topping.
20.
With solar, it's like 25 to 30 now. It's gotten better, but wind, I mean, about 40%. So it's just not nearly as competitive.
Yeah, I think one of the things you're definitely going to want to do is, as the negative, have a block for the money saved, argument that the app is inevitably going to run. Right, you want to be able to say, look, no, and what you're describing is probably the best one, right? Where you're going to say, look, we've got X amount of gigawatts or whatever that we're going to have to provide.
We have a certain energy demand we have to meet. That is a given in the round.
Right, and the whole world does, not just us, like everybody does. And right now, we do not have the capacity to do that in the free market. That's why we have subsidies in the first place, wherever they go.
Right, and the other argument to make there, if you really want to get out in the weeds a little bit, is that renewable energy requires a lot more transmission build out. And that's currently something the U.S. government is stonewalling. It's expensive, it's mired in red tape.
Yeah.
Plus,
so you're
it's not necessarily a possible, at least on a short term.
I mean, you're going to want to be able to say to the affirmative, wait, you think we're going to save money by totally transitioning our power grid? Or, I mean, you don't have to totally transition your power grid, but that's the ultimate goal.
I mean, you basically do, though. If we go completely to variable renewable energy, you're going to need all kinds of smart grid technologies.
But I mean, just from getting rid of these subsidies, that in and of itself would not require you to completely transition. But what you need to point out is, like, ultimately, at the end of the day, even if we get rid of these subsidies, and that's not going to get rid of all fossil fuels, but we're going to be starting down the road of getting away from fossil fuels. That's the whole point of doing it. And if you think that's going to be less expensive, right? No, it's going to be more expensive, because at whatever margin, like you talked about the 20 million barrels or whatever that wouldn't have been produced, whatever amount that doesn't come out of the ground is going to have to be made up for in some other sector like wind or solar, and those are sectors that are going to require more subsidies, not less.
And I think there's a greater cost too than just like the fiscal dollar amount. Kind of relating back to what I mentioned on the pro side of things, international problems exist with going towards renewable energy sources as well, because a lot of times these require a lot more like precious metals that we rely on places like China to get. So it's not just a cost, it's like, okay, we're becoming more and more dependent or reliant on other countries rather than what we can produce at home.
I do think those are viable.
Well, the other thing to talk about is it's a lot easier to decarbonize the electric grid than it is to decarbonize things like transportation, because let's be real, there are no electric planes. So even if you electrified cars and rail, we would still have a lot of things like boats and planes that we would need like biofuels to use. And you could run all sorts of arguments about why biofuels are bad for the environment. And there are going to be some debaters who will perhaps argue that nuclear is bad for the environment, hydro is bad for the environment. So just be prepared for those alternatives or worse kind of case.
Yeah.
But with the renewables, you could run all sorts of impacts about like dependence on China.
Well, just to be clear about what that is, there are arguments, and I've seen people talking about them, that renewables require a lot more rare earth minerals. China has virtually a monopoly on many rare earth minerals, and you can look in the news today about China trying to extend its influence over like the NBA and Blizzard software. So if we become even more dependent on them for our energy, can you imagine how much soft power and control China would have over us? And that's bad.
Well, not to mention environmental arguments, because this isn't just you dig in the dirt with a little shovel and you have your rare earth mineral. I mean, usually you're extracting them out of the seabed using all sorts of disruptive technologies.
Also, you're probably exploiting really cheap labor in like developing countries to get these mines
that's actually
working
a really
in the
good
first
argument
place.
that Josh just brought up. One of the big things that's been brought up is in Africa, these rare earth mineral extractions use child labor and all sorts of human rights violations.
And defend it with child soldiers and all this
Right,
other
like
stuff.
14-hour days to make 10 cents an hour.
And look, let's be blunt. At the end of the day, as bad as that is it going to by itself outweigh climate change? No. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to hit back on climate change with some of the stuff Alicia talked about earlier, and then just give them enough stuff they have to deal with in other areas, right? The stuff we're talking about here, like China soft power or environmental degradation or child labor, I'm not saying it's not important, but you do need stuff like that in your case to just give the AF more stuff to deal with, right? So they don't have the luxury of just purely fighting you on climate change.
And who knows, maybe it does strike a note with your judge and he's like, oh, well, yeah, that's probably not a good thing, even if you want to assume that climate change is going to be fixed.
Last thing I've got real quick on the neg is I do think politics disads have some ground here. If you're not familiar with politics disads, the basic idea is if you do X, it will result in a political trade-off that is bad, right? And so on this, the same article I cited earlier from Robinson Meyer in The Atlantic, it kind of talks about how because arguably the effects of getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies would be, very limited. You're going to get rid of a very limited percentage of global carbon emissions, but the costs could be very visible. And what he talks about how is you want to see a poor person on the cover of a magazine who can't afford heating oil, and that's going to be like what the public associates with the idea of getting rid of these subsidies. And so the idea is, look, he's arguing, and there are others who basically argue, we're probably only going to get one big chance to do a major thing about climate change. That's why you have proposals like the Green New Deal, one big effort to do it. So if we're going to do it, and it's going to have cost, and opponents are going to come forward, and like conservative commentators are going to come forward and say, oh, look at these people, can't afford to get to work, can't afford to buy gas for their car, we might as well go ahead and do something that's going to be big, right?
If you're going to swing hard.
Yeah, because the idea is we're only going to get one chance at this. There's going to be blowback. You shouldn't spend your political capital doing something that's not going to have, what he's saying is, you shouldn't spend pick your political battles. You shouldn't spend the political capital doing something this limited when we really ought to be focusing on something like just go ahead and do a full-on carbon tax.
Right, because the fossil fuel industry supports politicians. It's well documented, like $350 million per year kind of support. So if you're going to do something, even if it's not going to have a positive impact, like removing fossil fuel subsidies, that's going to be seen by the public as a huge action. So when you push for more changes, they're going to say, we've already done something.
How much more do y'all want from us?
We've already hurt our chances of re-election. We're not going to do anything else for you. It just follows logical sense, just in terms of time it takes to pass legislation, political capital, because this isn't something that's going to be popular, especially with Republicans, but even Democrats take money from fossil fuel companies.
And what's important to note is that while you make blocks and cards for just about everything, this is one of those that for us it would be, there's nothing really you can prepare for. It's just something you need to know, be knowledgeable about, and know how to present the argument during the round.
All right, y'all. Well, as you can see, Neg played out a lot better than a lot of us thought it would. I think there are a lot of viable arguments on it. So that will wrap us up on that, and we will come back in just a second and do some final parting thoughts. So, final thoughts really quickly. For me, I would basically say a couple of things. First of all, I think a certain measure of just basic literacy in economics is important here. I think understanding the idea of what a negative externality is. Like if you don't get that, go Google it, go read the Wikipedia page and understand how, when a company creates a bad thing in the world, we try to make them pay for it. And then understand how subsidies work. When we want to get more of something, we provide more of it, right? And understand how they affect prices and things like that. And just be able to converse about the basic economics of it. I think that is extremely important and be able to do that. Beyond that, there's a lot of data here, right? And there's no way around having to understand, for example, the statistics that Alicia talks about on the negative about, lowering costs in other countries. There's no way to get around understanding the sort of causal link about how much of climate change will be prevented, how much will this contribute to that. Those are just statistical, factual things that you have to know. So you've got to do that work. You've got to do the reading. You've got to take the time to just get that in your brain. If you don't have that in your brain, you're going to have a hard time. But beyond that, right, at the end of the day, as with so many resolutions, when we have complicated stuff, it is a matter of, assuming you've got the facts right, telling a simple story, right? And on the app, the story is, why in the world are we paying people to make more of something that we should be charging them for, right? We should be charging them for the externalities that they create, not paying them to do it. And on the negative, the argument is basically that, well, hold on, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Like, we don't get to choose what kind of fossil fuels the world is going to use, and if we raise the price on these, they might pick worse things. And also, there's the possibility of counterplans and politics this adds, and just understand that. But basically, be able to know the facts and tell the story. That's kind of what I say in just pretty much every case. And so those are kind of my general thoughts on the resolution. You guys?
Well, my general 2 cents is just kind of like what specifically I talked about on the pro and con. Remember that it's not just lives, it's not just dollar signs. There's other broader intangible impacts of doing things that are affecting people on a national scale. So that is, reliance on places like China or having, distrust within federal governments, within international government communities, stuff like that. It's not just dollar signs, it's not just lives, although those are important. There are squirrels that you can get your opponent to chase or waste a lot of time on by bringing up stuff like that. It may strike a chord with the judge, or it may really appeal or come up important later in the case if they really rely on one thing.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for the affirmative is you've got to win like that argument that subsidies include externalities. I don't really see too many ways that you can win if you don't win that argument, because even though climate change is a huge impact, there's other impacts that we've shown on the negative that I think would really give you a run for your money. On the neg, I think the important thing is picking a theme and sticking to it. Like if you're going to run a counter plan, like come full force with why your counter plan solves way better than fossil fuels ever could.
Don't equivocate on little things.
Definitely not. Like you need to really hammer home, this is how my plan has been shown empirically to do way better. And we've shown with fossil fuel subsidies, it doesn't really affect the climate much at all. And politically, you could still argue that you'd have the same benefits in terms of revenue coming in from cap and trade and carbon taxes as you would from fossil fuel subsidies.
And my last thing kind of goes back to what Brett said is there's tons of evidence out here. You're going to need to know all the big cards, really big studies like the IMF when it brings up certain figures that are going to come up all the time. If you can find things about methodology or the way studies were conducted or reported that like delegitimize or add legitimacy to your own, you should definitely know those, because those are the little things that can twist something where even if your opponent's card necessarily isn't wrong, it casts doubt on your opponent, and the judges have to consider that.
This is where we put the more you know logo up in front of the video. So anyway, a challenging topic. Going to be a lot of great tournaments in November and December. So we wish you guys the best of luck. Hope you have fun out there on the competitive trail. And as always, we will sign off with our usual have fun, work hard, and hail state.